Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: a murder on campus. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Murder Most Foul. Today, a little different. I have, which I haven't had too many times, I have two guests. And it's important that I have two guests, and we'll find out why in a moment. They both wrote together. First of all, I should point out, it'll become clear in a moment or two, they're brothers. And they wrote this book together, and it's about a specific murder case. We'll talk about that. But the title of the book is Murder on Campus: The Professor and the Cop. And I'll let you people at home figure out which is which. Which one do you think is the professor, and which one do you think is the cop? But so their names appear in the bottom there a little bit, but up again, I don't know how these screens set up. But the gentleman with the flag behind him, he is the cop, and he is Cameron Santana. The gentleman who looks a little more professorial with the curly hair and the glasses, he's the professor, and he is Brian Santana, and I'm me. So we'll get into soon the case and why. And again, first of all, it is a cold case. And I've read some books on true crime or stories that say one of the things that draws people to true crime is they like a solution. Mm-hmm. They like it to have a wrapped up ending. The guy goes to prison, or he goes to the electric chair, or he's killed by the police. This one is a cold case. It's not the oldest one I've covered, but it is an old case. A cold case, and goes back, we'll find out, to 1973. So it's way back there. So obviously these guys aren't old enough. I was in college, but you guys are probably not quite 1973 college age. But so you went back to a case that obviously it's cold in the sense it's an open investigation. Most of these cases, even though there's not a lot of work done, they don't end. So that's the case of this one, and that is one of the reasons, and guys going to tell me why you wrote about it in a moment. So let's begin with a little bio from both of you, and it's up to you, Cameron. I'll cut this out if you don't want to do it, but the story I love is the story of your first body, and I think it just tells the audience the whole concept. The way it's recounted is joyous because it's not just the facts, ma'am. I mean, you recount what this was like. Would you care to tell, as a lead into you as a police officer for years, and when did you see your first body officially?
Yeah, that's a really good story to tell and to definitely lead off with. So I had just graduated the Raleigh Police Department. And the way that the police department used to do is that you spent 18 weeks on training, and then you had a 2-week eval. So for 18 weeks, you had a training officer with you who would ride shotgun and essentially tell you what to do. And I don't think a lot of people can appreciate that when you come out of the academy, even though with Raleigh's academy, it was very long and they covered a lot of information, you really don't know what you're doing. You know, the academy teaches you how to be a police officer. The streets teaches you how to be a cop. And so I'm riding around, I've got my brasses shined, you could stand my shirt up, it's creased so much. Right. I'm ready to go. And we're driving around. It's midnight shift that I started out on. And it's in Southeast Raleigh, which I don't know anywhere in Southeast Raleigh except for where you go to concerts at. And one of the first calls that we got was the code name for it was a 103, which means that someone's been shot and killed. And then they gave additional comments that 2 people have been shot, and they're at this intersection, Bragg and East, which is a notorious intersection in Raleigh That's where a lot of the crime happens, and we happen to be right around the corner from it. Now, as you can tell, even though I've got a Hispanic last name, my it's me and my training officer. We're both two white guys going into this entirely African American community with a small Hispanic population. There's no white people. If white people come through there, they're picking up prostitutes or trying to buy heroin. And so we get this call there. And as soon as we show up, the suspect description is a black male wearing dark clothing. It just so happens that one of the popular things to wear during that time was these plain black t-shirts that they would buy at the convenience store. So the majority of the people out there are wearing black clothing. We're the first one on scene. There's two dead guys that are at this intersection just laying in the front yard. And I turn to my training officer and I'm like, what am I supposed to do? And he tells me, stop someone. So I see this young guy running from the scene and he's wearing black pants and a black shirt. So I chase after him like a cheetah because I'm right out of the academy, young and dumb. And I tackle him and I'm like, why are you running? And I won't repeat the words, but he says that there's two dead people back there. And I had to think about it for a second. I think then reality struck that, you know what? I would be running too if two people got, killed in front of me. So I dusted him off, got his name, took his statement, and then I was given the prestigious assignment of guarding the dead body. So you've got, when what's supposed to happen during an investigation is that you lock down the crime scene and that you're canvassing for witnesses, but you're not moving the dead body until investigators come and the scene is processed. So someone has to make sure that no one messes with the body. So it's my job to stand there and essentially, guard a dead body. Well, the funny thing that happened was that during that time, they had on cell phones, they would have the ringtones that would go off. And this isn't like the good ringtones now. It's like the cheesy rap music, that's very digital. And so this like digitized rap song keeps on going on the guy's phone. And I didn't know what to do. Like, am I supposed to ignore it? Are you supposed to like answer it? And so I saw one of the senior officers and I said, hey, this guy's phone keeps on ringing. Do you want me to answer it? She was like, no, you idiot, just stand beside the body and keep your mouth shut. And so that was my experience as my first real dead body and becoming a cop.
So, Brian, let's talk about a little bit about you then.
Yeah, so so my background, my undergraduate background was in drama and theater. I did dramaturgy, which is basically like being a theater historian, but we worked on a lot of productions. In my master's was in English, focusing on American literature, and then my PhD was from George Washington, and that was focusing on literature and culture as well. So, so by training, technically, I'm a 19th century American culture and literature specialist, but I have not worked in that field for a while. And at most of the schools I've worked at for the past 10 years or so, I've been the true crime professor because of my popular true crime writing seminars.
And I do like there's you guys have insights into your life in there, which is great. And why don't you just share with my audience Aunt Minnie?
So Aunt Minnie was like she was one of those people that was not biologically our aunt, which I mean I actually didn't even know that till we were older, but I just assumed she was like one of our aunts or cousins in the way that in the South kind of like aunt, it can be an honorary term that's bestowed on anyone who's also like a close family friend, right? And so we had a number of aunts who weren't biologically related that were very close to us when we were growing up. And she was one of my grandmother's close friends. And one of my vivid memories when we were children, and one of my kind of introductions to true crime was, during the 1980s. And my grandmother would sometimes drop us off, and Aunt Minnie was She was a single woman who lived by herself, who never had who thought of us as almost like children of hers. And she loved taking us out shopping and doing things with us. And I have very vivid memories of staying at her house on a few occasions. And she would get us food and kind of sit us on a couch and have those little 1950s TV dinner trays. And then this little, small, wiry woman who was very sweet would turn on Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. And I remember these shows scaring the hell out of me when I was younger, but I also couldn't turn my attention away from them. And long after the show was over, we'd go to bed, and every time the air conditioning would come on or something, it would startle me. And so that was kind of my introduction to true crime, both Aunt Minnie, and then later the kind of tawdry paperback books that you would get at like Walden Books or B.D. Dalton and a lot of these stores that don't really exist anymore. But that was that was kind of my introduction. Was it from her? These Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted, but primarily Unsolved Mysteries.
And you involved or interested your students in the? Didn't you have like a class or a thing where you were using students or teaching students about true crime?
Yeah, and so I was teaching a class that was focusing. This is many years ago. A class that was about research methods. So teaching students how to kind of to find everything from different types of primary and secondary sources. So things you would get like in public records to like working in historical archives. And I have been kind of informally interested in researching the kind of Virginia Olsen case for a long time. And when the true crime boom hit in 2014, this is around the time of Serial, where everything kind of exploded. For listeners that remember Serial, and I noticed that my students were coming into class and they were very interested in and following kind of true crime podcasts and things like that. And so I thought at the time it would be a good way to teach different research skills. So with my classes, I started a writing true crime class that was really just fulfilling a research requirement initially, where we would take a single case each semester. And as a class, we would do everything from I would show them how to file FOIA requests, and we would do public records. We'd talk about how to do kind of human source interviews, how to locate experts in areas that you did not have knowledge in, to interpret primary sources, because I think something that sometimes happens is people imagine, well, I've got a case file, I've got a medical examiner's report, and then you look at it and you're like, what the hell does this actually mean? I can't understand or read any of this. So they would do interviews with people who were capable of reading these. They would do different his research surrounding the kind of history and culture of region and people, and then also interviews with people either tied to the original investigation or people who were impacted by it, and we would spend the semester working on those. And so around campus, I was kind of the kind of true crime professor, which is what my handle is on Instagram, and kind of why I've kind of maintained that moniker to this day. But yeah, the kind of writing true crime class was really popular, and we would take these cases and we would do a kind of deep dive over the course of 4 months into a single case.
Now we're gonna let you rest yourself there, and we'll let Cameron, even if it's not, you guys work together, so I can ask a question. I'm sure either one of you can answer it. So who again, Brian just said it was sort of a case he was interested, but who was the first to broach the concept of working together?
Oh, well, this is kind of laughable how funny it is.
Go ahead, I
That,
love laughs.
yeah. So at the time, I had stepped away from being a full-time police officer. I had a daughter that had some special needs, and we spent 98 days in the NICU. And when I finally decided that full-time police work need to take a break, and so I went to a smaller department where the chief just let me name my schedule, and that was okay, but there wasn't any crime, and it wasn't very fulfilling. And it definitely was not the pace I was accustomed to with being with a larger department. And one day Brian called me and he's telling me, or he started to call me and tell me about the true crime class they had. And we would talk about some of the cases. And I found myself actually researching them, which when I was a full-time cop, I really didn't watch cop shows. I would watch sports, comedies and cheap horror movies. I stayed away from true crime because a lot of times it was cheesy for me. But so I'm catching myself looking into these cases, and then one day he came to me and he was like, you know, there's this case about Virginia Olson. She was murdered in 1973 on the campus of UNC Asheville, and he's given me the nuts and bolts about it, and he was like, I'm thinking about writing an article about it, and I wanted your help. Maybe if we have enough, it'll be enough for a book, but we'll see. And I just casually was like, yeah, sure, whatever. I didn't think this was going to be that big of a commitment. And I was thinking more of the lines of an article. And then it was like a day or two later, he calls me and he was like, hey, just let you know, we're gonna be on contract with Wild Blue Press. And what's really funny about this is I didn't know how hard it was to actually get a book contract. And so when we started to do our first couple podcasts promoting the book, I'm telling the story and people were like, Brian, how did you get a contract in like 2 days? And then he finally admitted that, oh, he had been working on this for quite some time. And, that was the way that he phrased it, was a way to get me on board without saying no. Yeah. So we put this in our book, we put a timeline for the readers, which we felt was important. That way they can really see how narrow of gap this is. But we know that that day she was in her dorm and she was getting ready for a Spanish final. And so she collected her books. And when she left the dorm, she ran into a few friends and she was planning on walking over to where they had a large garden on campus. And that's where she was going to stop and study. But it was a nice day. And so when she got there, she decided to take a trail, which we assume it was a trail, to this more secluded spot, connected to the garden. So you've got a 50-acre plot of land that is essentially backs up to that area. So there's trails. We know people are walking. This is in April, so a lot of people are out that day. And she found a large rock to sit and study on. And we can walk through that entire day if you'd like. But we know essentially that's where she is eventually found. And she's found by two high schoolers who were leaving a weenie roast.
And so tell us a little bit about, we should mention, of course, her full name was Virginia Marie Olson, and she went by the nickname Ginger.
Yeah, so Virginia Olson, her father worked for the Department of Agriculture. She had grown up she lived in other places, but primarily in Fairfax County, Virginia, in an area called McLean. And so, basically, to understand Ginger Olson, in the most of the people we talked to were friends with her in high school and in college, but many of her closest friends were still her core high school group. She had kind of discovered that she had a flair for poetry and had discovered a love for acting her junior year in high school and had become really involved with that. She had been attracted in 1971 to UNC Asheville. Like many people, Asheville then and today was known as a kind of artistic community where people who were interested in, it's a kind of artistic kind of enclave in a Western North Carolina kind of area, and that's home to some of the oldest writing groups in the United States and theater companies and other things. And so she was attracted to Asheville, and when she was in Asheville, then she was very religious, had went to a daily prayer group. She carried around a spiritual journal with her every day where she would write down her thoughts. She had just declared a major the semester before she was killed. But before that, she had started to distinguish herself in theater. She won some what was called like forensics competitions, which are essentially like speech competitions. And she had won forensics competitions. Her father, who was a who was a good enough baseball player. He could have played professional baseball. He had actually he had gone deaf, and she became very involved, volunteering her time, doing things like working with people who had everything from hearing impairments to recording books for people who were blind. She was involved in lots of kind of service related things like that, and was actively writing poetry. And she was romantically involved. We spent a lot of time talking to her boyfriend, a guy named Jeff Doyle, in the book, and he was the last. She had just come off spring break in 1973 with him. A lot of things in her life were going well. She had had a prominent role in her first theater show the previous semester. She had won some awards for these forensic competitions. She was just coming off of spring break with him and had arrived back. And she was really, at the time she was killed, she was trying to figure out, like many college students, kind of what was going to be next for her. She was thinking about part of the reason she went to UNC Asheville was because her family had her father had been transferred through the Department of Agriculture to a town about 3 hours from Asheville in North Carolina, and so she went to Asheville partly to be closer to home and also be able to pursue her artistic interest. But she also missed her family, and she missed some of her friends in Virginia. And I know from some of her letters that she wrote back to her friends, she was thinking about transferring to a college this right before she was killed that would be even closer to her parents. And so she had a lot of things she was trying to figure out. She had a very serious romantic relationship that she was involved with, and she was trying to figure out what her life would look like. She was really concerned with getting work for, she wrote about in her letters about kind of getting summer stock jobs. If you're a theater person, that's essentially like what you do during the summer. And so summer stock jobs and even some print modeling work, which is something we uncovered that had never been revealed before, and we think potentially ties to the guy who we think is responsible. But yeah, so she was very much at a kind of crossroads in her life at the time she was killed. And that was one of the things that really appealed to me, because in 1999, when I first encountered her, I was living away from home for the very first time. And my very first day in college was one of my theater electives. I ended up becoming a theater major, but I was taking my theater elective was the first class I ever took as a college student. And I was waiting in the lobby, and I saw this big picture of this beautiful young woman that's on the cover of our book. And an upperclassman who was coming out of the class came up to me and said, "Hey, that's Virginia Olsen. She was a student here, and she was killed a long time ago." Later, someone else told me this student was raped. Someone else told me she was raped and killed in the theater. There was always these contradictory stories about like who she was. And lots of theaters, in fairness, have these like ghost stories. And that's kind of what she was at the time that I first encountered her story. But it made a deep impression on me because I was trying to figure out kind of what my life was going to look like, and very nervous about living away from home and just try what I was going to be doing. And the very first kind of extended conversations I had as a college student after moving to campus less than 36 hours before was about this person who, like me, had come to UNC Asheville to study drama and lost her life. And so it made a deep impression. And I really have spent over the last 20 years just wanting to understand exactly who she was, what happened to her, why it happened. And now we're like at this point is this interesting kind of full circle moment, because not only do we have this book, but also some of her friends are also people that I count as my friends now. So it's kind of it's a kind of interesting kind of movement. I will say also her professor, a guy named Arnold Wingrove. You mentioned that most of these people would be dead. He's actually still alive. He's 93 years old. He actually is still writing right now. When I originally contacted him to interview him for this book, he said he was 93 at the time, and he said, "I'll get back to you soon, but I've got a book tour this summer. I'm really busy right now, and so we'll talk as soon as I get back from my travels." And I thought, like, what? Like, I hope you survive your travels. But like, but yeah, like a lot of these people were. I was surprised at the number of people that are still around from that period.
For the story to go forward, I think we have to put some of the details of the crime because it's important. I mean, and she's discovered dead, but that there's several ways to be that. So I think it is important for the story that we share that.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's what we know. We know that she was on a rock, and we know that she is visible enough where a guy that is hiking that day actually passes her by twice. So he comes, he sees her actually talking with a gentleman on the rock, and then when he comes back around, no one is there, but her books are flapping in the wind. And so, and we include this in our timeline, that's when we believe that the rape and murder occurred. And what we know about what happened is that the suspect either or suspects either removed her or used some type of threat of physical violence to get her off that rock. And I believe it was about 15 yards away from that. And during the assault, we know that she was raped. We know that she had abrasions on her knees too, so I don't know if that was from trying to crawl away or if that was during the assault. But at some point, she is stabbed in the heart with a knife, and then her throat is cut. Another piece of this is that the suspect also used her shirt to make bindings, and he bound her arms, legs, and gagged her. So, when you're talking about seeing a dead body for the first time, these two high school kids, they're this may have been their first body. I don't know, but it's probably the most horrific thing that they've seen. Where you've got a person that bled out. That's another thing that we know. We know that that she died because of the stabbing, because the neck didn't bleed. So the neck was kind of an afterthought. But once they saw that, we know that that's when they went and called 911 and the police came.
And again, we have to keep pointing out for my audience, because I kept having to point that out as I was reading it. This is sort of a retrospect. In other words, all the stuff that you were doing, all the stuff you're sharing with us, is not something happened a week ago, a month ago. And so we also have to put the time on it of 1973.
Right.
Now, we're also used to Law and Order. In 22 minutes, you got the crime solved. Another 22 minutes, you got the trial, and you're done. That the biggest thing, and we'll keep coming back and back, is because of forensics at that time. It's not what we have now. Now, it's not 1940. They were probably, I forget, I used to know this, like when DNA really, came in, and I know CODIS was much later, but Brian, that really wasn't the case, was it, in this, because of the time?
Yeah, so the forensics at the time were a bit more limited. I mean, of course, they have fingerprints, which everyone knows. They could also do a limited amount of things with like semen at the time. They could determine blood type from semen. They could also run in the 1970s what was called a secretor test, so that a certain percentage of the population naturally secretes red blood cells in their sweat and semen. So it is not with the level of it doesn't pinpoint things as much as DNA would, but let's say we can knock down like a percentage of the population. I think Cameron might be able to correct me on this. I think it's about 30% of the population are secretors, but but they could run those types of tests. They could do a blood type from the semen, and they had some, basic forensics of that time, but it was quite different. And why this is ultimately going to matter, which Cameron could probably speak to more, would be that there weren't protocols for the retention of evidence that would preserve materials, so that when the case goes beyond a certain point, if there's not a quick arrest, when we're looking at this 50 years down the line, yes, we have a lot of technology, but because of the way that some of the materials were stored, or even which materials they decide to retain, is going to place pretty big limitations on even what modern forensics can do with some of these older cases.
Now, Cameron, how did they originally approach the case? What was sort of their, I mean, you as a police officer go out and you've been told me there's protocol and training, and you know that you do this, or, you secure the scene, you do X, Y, and Z. If you're then an investigator detective, you do these other things. I'm onto the DNA, which is fine. But how did they originally approach the case?
Well, and that's the issue, is that in 1973, that's when it's called North Carolina training and standards was actually developed. And what that does is that's the governing body to require mandatory training for law enforcement in North Carolina. So a lot of the training was just hands-on, or on-the-job training, and it's kind of passed down. And you've got to think about too, this is the people that they're recruiting are normally former military, which is how law enforcement got a lot of their traditions, which is great, but there's a big difference between learning to follow orders and learning to look at this crime scene in a more scientific way. And the protocols that you were talking about, like for example, that we have in 2026, that was not on their radar in 1973. So, for example, when I was given the story about my first dead body, we had a literal checklist that everyone memorized that was, you made sure that the crime scene was safe. You then roped off the crime scene. You start interviewing witnesses and victims. And, it's a standard protocol, right? We know that in 1973, that just didn't happen. And we know that because her roommate was even able to walk into the crime scene and show a police officer a picture of her and ask her if that's the person that was killed. And we can also look at the photos that we've seen, which are limited, where you see police officers carrying the body without any gloves on. And it just looks very chaotic, honestly. And that's not a slight against them. They just didn't know better. And so the effect of that today, when we're trying to look at cold cases, is you were talking about DNA. Well, we reached out to some friends of mine who are investigators for the medical examiner's office in North Carolina. And I asked them, like, okay, if you were looking at this case, what pieces of evidence would you be interested in? And they immediately said the bindings, because when you are forming those knots, you're going to leave copious amounts of skin cells on the knots, and that should be well preserved. We also know that in this case, they took a semen sample. Okay, so we've got the actual evidence, but because of the standards back then, and I think because of some honestly just poor evidence keeping by the department, I don't believe a lot of those things are around, especially the semen sample. I'm 99% sure that that is gone. So Brian worked on getting the medical examiner's report, which he can go into detail of how much trouble that was. I thought that it was going to be a really easy task to get the search warrant. And that's one of the things when we first started out, we were kind of chalking up responsibilities. And I thought, okay, this is a public document. I'll call some buddies who may work in that area. I'll be a hero very quickly as soon as we find out, who's on this warrant. And so I called the courthouse, and the first day they told me that they couldn't find it. And I called basically every other day, and they kept on blowing me off and telling me, different places to search for it. Until finally we did an interview with Kevin Taylor, who is the cold case detective on the case. And we point blank asked him, like, hey, we know that this document exists. It refers to it in one of the newspaper articles. We just want a copy, and we're fairly certain that the courts have lost this. So can you give us your copy? And of course, they said no. And I said, okay, well, can you tell me who the search warrant is on? He wouldn't let us know that either. So that's when it just started with a barrage of emails and phone calls to every which place I could find in Asheville until finally I believe that, and I don't know this for sure, but I think that they got the police department to give it to the city who then provided it to me. But either way, it took me 6 months to get that search warrant.
And the search warrant, again, we're now starting to work our way into the possible suspects. The search warrant was of someone that the police at the time felt was, and you can tell us why, what it had to be in the warrant, why they thought that, this was a reasonable suspect. And what was the name of that person that was on the warrant so that they could go and search? Was it an arrest warrant or a search warrant?
It was a search warrant for
Search
John
warrant.
Rivas Jr.
Rivas. Okay, so he's one of the suspects. So why don't we've
And
mentioned his
then,
name, and was he like one of the first people they were focusing in on?
Brian, do you want to take that?
He was a suspect that emerged within the first like week or two of the investigation. So there was it's a more complicated story, but essentially there were witnesses that spotted him riding around with another individual around the botanical gardens or in the area of the botanical gardens on the day of the murder. Then there were two witnesses who saw Virginia Olsen going into the garden. There was someone who observed, as Cameron said earlier, someone wearing the same clothes John Rivas was wearing that was sitting with her. John Rivas, when he was interviewed, he admitted to being in the botanical gardens, but he lied to the investigator about where he was at. He said he was literally in the botanical gardens, but the agent who executed the search warrant had pointed out that he did admit seeing Virginia Olsen, and that the individual he was with, a leader of this kind of fringe religious kind of cult in Black Mountain, North Carolina, named James Gore, who would later become a religious advisor to Ronald Reagan, by the way, it was pointed out a girl, is what it said in the search warrant. And so pointed out her to him. So it raised a lot of questions to her, like, well, pointed her out. Was he pointing her out just because he saw her? Was he pointing her out because he was familiar with her? Like, what is their relationship? And we know that, but he acknowledges seeing her, and the SBI agent, a guy named Charlie Chambers, who was a very well respected member of the State Bureau of Investigation and had been tied to several other high profile crimes, he essentially says in the search warrant that he's not telling the truth. Now, he doesn't know why he's not telling the truth, but he does know that it is physically impossible for him to have been able to see Virginia Olsen from where he claimed to be at. And he estimates he would have had to be likely, I think, about 30 to 50 feet away in order to describe her in the way that he did. And then the last piece of evidence that Lisa's touched on in the search warrant that was part of the record was that about 45 minutes after the murder is committed, John Rivas is very distressed. He goes home. He knocks on his neighbor, a woman named Judy Needle. He knocks on her apartment door. She is kind of an eccentric person who was like a psychic. She taught in the parapsychology department that's now defunct at Duke University. She became a advisor to horror films like Silent Night, Deadly Night later on in her career. But she lives next door to this guy, and he knocks on the door and he is shaking, and he asks her to pray with him. And is very distressed and is muttering things about like a bloody mess and things like that underneath his breath. He's fairly incoherent. He suffers from severe mental health issues, and that's the part that's officially known. We found a lot more information about this interaction with Judy Needle and John Rivas through doing our research, but that was the rationale in this search warrant that Charlie Chambers takes to the magistrate, and that is what we include in the book as well, where you can actually read his rationale for the search warrant.
Cameron, how long was he? In other words, obviously he was not the one that. I mean, they didn't arrest him, charge him, and send him to court. So what happened with him? I mean, we got the search warrant. There's some problems there that you guys discover in retrospect. Did you feel that the authorities at the time were as suspicious as you are now of him?
I think that there's a lot of layers to this, and part of the problem in this investigation is that John Rivas Jr. comes from a very wealthy family, and he's got a political background and in his family. And so right after the murder, he actually goes to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and his family gets him out of town. And then after that, he starts bouncing around in mental institutions. And you've got to think about this is 1973. So when you're a investigator and you're trying to do an interview, you're calling a house best case scenario, but a lot of times you're driving places and knocking on doors trying to find people. So I think he was probably, in all reality, a very hard person to get in contact with. And on top of that, you've got a police department that honestly just does not have experience with dealing with crimes like this. And so I think that that's when the debacle started, is you had a poor management of a crime scene. And we know, even, and we talked about this in the book, where her body was at the morgue within, I believe, like an hour and a half from, them getting there. So this was not a, you know, let's take our time and make sure we get this right type of situation like we would do now. And again, so you've got that, and then you've got police officers, which Brian can tell you more about Judy Needle and that kind of encounter. But what should have happened is that there should have been a canvass right away for witnesses, and Judy called 911. An officer should have been right over at her house right away, and that just didn't happen as well. So you've got a continuation of just mistake after mistake after mistake. And then you've got a guy that's got the resources to be hidden from the police.
And despite all of these mistakes that were made, to go back to your original question, this was the sole main suspect that they were looking at for 16 years, basically. So they devoted 2 officers from the State Bureau who were full-time, who just worked this case as their only job for about 6 months. And that was actually quite controversial at the time, because they were short on manpower at the time in Western North Carolina. And they have these 2 officers there that were just kind of investigating this one case. And so it wasn't for lack of effort, and they did look in other places throughout the year. There was a task force that was formed in 1978 or 1977 that revisited all of the evidence and kind of re-interviewed people and looked at this again. And they all kept coming to the same conclusion, that it was most likely John Rivas. And in the 1980s, they even take a contingent of detectives when they finally tracked down John Rivas. So he was being shielded in a mental hospital that was run by his brother-in-law in Boston, Massachusetts. He ends up dying and living out his last years in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they take a contingent from the Asheville Police Department to Santa Fe, New Mexico, in one last effort to try to get a confession from him. And they do so in a kind of surprise interview, because they don't want his family to find out about it. The confession, they don't actually succeed in getting that, and he dies in 1994. But and essentially, what's telling to me is, despite what the investigators will tell you today, which I don't believe, I think they know, even the current investigators, that this is the individual responsible. Because all media coverage, including public statements from the police department, cease after John Rivas dies. They stop talking about the case. And so one of the things that was really curious, and we were really interested in knowing about John Rivas early on, was because he was the only suspect or person of interest that was never publicly named. Every other person, from a 19-year-old kid to a suspect who is a rapist who lived in the area for a period, who was a UNCA graduate who had moved to Florida and was arrested for something unrelated, they name everybody involved. They'll give you names of the parents, the addresses of this 14-year-old who found the bodies. They kind of, they're not shy about sharing names. And this is the only person that was never named. And so we really were interested in finding a lot of information about him, but it was hard for not only the reasons the investigators had, but also every step of the way as a researcher, there were also a lot of other documents that were destroyed. He was a Korean War veteran, and the military had a large fire that took place in the 1960s, I believe, that destroyed a lot of their records. And this impacted and caused whole chaos for the VA and so forth. So his entire military record was destroyed. We discovered that he had been arrested on voyeurism charges about 10 years before this murder in San Francisco. But when I called the San Francisco Police Department, they said that because of their retention records, the records had been destroyed. We knew that he was stalking and attempted to sexually assault a woman after Virginia Olsen in the late 70s, early 80s. But those records had also been destroyed in Santa Fe. So it was pretty much wherever we were turning, we would find these little traces of John Rivas, but a lot of the official records were destroyed. So a lot of it ended up coming back to people who had these interactions with him. And some of that information didn't come out for us till after the book was published.
But tell us about where Will Anarino comes in.
So he comes in around 1981, I believe. So he was investigating the murder of a woman named Mary Faye Burdett that we have a chapter on in the book, and this murder was significant because it took place about 15 feet from where Virginia Olsen's murder was. It was another rape and murder. He was at the time a very young kind of go-getter detective who was known for his thoroughness and kind of commitment to the job. And as part of his work on that case, he ended up working with the original State Bureau investigators who were in charge of the Olsen investigation from 73. So he's interacting with a lot of these investigators in the same spot that they investigated the Olsen murder, where they're exploring connections. And this made an impression on him. And when he would eventually become the chief of the Detective Bureau, is what it was called at the time, around 1981, one of the first things he does is reopen the Olsen case. And so he is fairly confident in their original conclusions, and the more he digs into it, the more convinced he becomes that he knows who's responsible for this. It makes a very public push to get the district attorney. He's successful to get the district attorney to really reactivate the investigation, and he makes an effort to get a confession from John Rivas. Will Anarino would eventually become the chief of police for Asheville and become, honestly, probably especially compared to Mike Lamb and some of the people they've had just recently who left, he's honestly the best chief of police Asheville's probably ever had, and he's in that position for about a decade.
And so he's not, again, being quiet about it. He is convinced, or that he believes it's Rivas.
Yes. He doesn't use Rivas's name publicly, but it drives him crazy. He gives these interviews where he said every single day it just drives him nuts that this guy is living his life. He knows where he's living at a certain point. He tracks him down to Santa Fe, and he said the fact that he's like living his life as if this didn't happen, and he doesn't feel like, when he looks at the case file and the evidence, to him it is so overwhelming and so self-evident. It's like, why is this guy not arrested? This is one, that's part of the reason why it's one of the first things he does is to reopen it, because he thinks this is one that's 100% solvable. That the mystery, this is not a whodunit. The mystery isn't who's responsible. The difficulty is in getting people to go along with the prosecution if he makes an arrest.
But there's Richard Levi Jenkins and Terry Wyatt.
Terry Hyatt.
I'm sorry?
Terry Hyatt.
Jerry, is it? I'm sorry, I got a T there.
Terry Hyatt.
Jerry and Richard Levi Jenkins. So those are other two prominent names. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about was this done at the time, again, confused, or just stuff you went back and picked up some stuff, or were they looked at seriously during one of these investigations, either or both?
With Terry Hyatt, that was a theory of ours. So we were looking at when we heard how brutal this was and that it occurred during the daytime, we thought that this is not the first time that someone has done this. And so I started to look at other murders in North Carolina, and I was trying to find any type of similarities to Virginia's murder. And one of the ones I found was Terry Hyatt. And so Terry actually is from Asheville. He would have been 16 at the time of the murder. We know that he had dropped out of high school by then. He was involved in the juvenile justice system for doing things like stealing cars, purse snatching, and crimes of that nature. And so my theory is I'm like, okay, this guy's from Asheville. He just so happens when he does murder people that he rapes them, stabs them in the chest, and then slits their throat, and then leaves them in remote areas. I thought that it was very coincidental that this was occurring. And so that's when the theory kind of started. But I think that when you're looking at cases like this, it's like when you're on the department and you're looking for a white Honda Accord that's a 98 with a spoiler on the back. You're going to end up seeing a lot of white Honda Accords, that match that description. And I feel like that's how it is with Terry, that I do not believe that he was responsible for Virginia's death. I think his number is higher than three personally, but I do not believe that he is the person actually responsible. He was just in the area at the time.
And there's a little. I got this place. I wanted to find a place to slip it in. So, Brian, didn't you? You wanted to become a pen pal of his, didn't you?
That was Cameron,
me.
actually.
Yes.
It was Cameron. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were going to be the pen pal.
Yeah. So that's another funny story because I had to tell my wife about it in case he wrote back and she got the mail. So I thought, okay, this guy's never been interviewed as far as we were concerned. And he definitely was in the area. And this is before we had received some additional information about Revis. And so I thought it was very a good possibility that he would be responsible. And I wanted to see if he would at least engage me with something. So I wrote him just this letter of asking him about his day. Was he into sports? Just trying to get a response. But the laughable part about it was I'm telling my wife this, and she's like, all right, so you're going to write someone that is on death row in North Carolina. I'm like, yeah, it's important for our book. We're trying to not leave a stone unturned. And she was like, are you sure that he's not getting out? It's like, well, he's got 3 life sentences. So I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, escape's an option, but yeah.
Let's take the other one. Like I said, Terry. Well, tell us about Richard Levi Jenkins.
So Richard Levi Jenkins was a guy who he murdered Mary Burdett. What got originally investigators interested in him was just the proximity of the body. For the same reason we were looked at Terry Hyatt. One of the things that was interesting to us about Terry Hyatt, in addition to what Cameron stated, was that he had also dumped some bodies not too far from that area later on. So this was an area that Virginia Olsen was in that was a kind of lover's lane area where teenagers would go as well. So Terry Hyatt would have been familiar with it, but also it was an area that Richard Levi Jenkins was also very familiar with, the guy who murdered Mary Burdett. So he was someone who had picked up Mary Burdett, who was a kind of poor woman without many relatives in the area or resources, and he had picked her up at a bar. They went to this Lovers Lane area, which happened to be where Virginia Olsen was murdered. And he gave a very confusing story to investigators originally. When he was questioned for this, he said that he had they had consensual sex, and then he passed out. And when he woke up, she had been murdered, and he didn't know what had happened. But the way he was a very unusual guy. One of the detectives who was in charge of the investigation, William Reno, he had told me that he was kind of like an inbred guy, was the way he described him. And so he was, he had murdered Mary Burdett after they had sex. And then the worst part about the story with him was that, and the way he was caught was a few days had gone by and he took a taxi cab back to the scene where her body was and he raped her corpse. And then he came out of the woods covered in blood and scared the hell out of the taxi driver, who calls the police. And so it wasn't necessarily Sherlock Holmes level mystery to solve this, but I think it does point to just what Cameron said about the fact that you look at the proximity of Virginia Olsen's body and some of the overlap with the crime, you would think like, okay, this guy's someone to really look at as a possibility for Virginia Olsen. And the investigators did. They did look into that, but he was excluded. So for me, one of the interesting things about Richard Levi Jenkins, though, is just that he's one of a series of curious coincidences that haunt this case, and that even though investigators are really honed in on John Rivas about 2 weeks into the case, they are forced, once they have no idea where Rivas is at, to consider other possibilities. And so whenever these coincidences start to pile up, they go down these different trails trying to figure out, is there a connection, whether it's an abduction of a woman named Karen McDonald that happens on the 1-year anniversary of Virginia Olsen's murder, whether it is the rape and murder of Mary Burdett, feet from where Virginia Olsen's body was found. Things like that are going to cause confusion in the investigation.
Well, one of the things that I also found sad, I mean, there's many things sad about it, about the case, certainly for the victim, but the university sort of, again, this was virginal territory for them. They'd never had a murder on campus, I believe. If I understand what you said, at the time, they didn't even have campus security.
That's correct.
Right.
They were the only university in the entire University of North Carolina system that did not have campus police, and it was specifically because of this murder that they got them. They went back to the legislature 2 months later, and the following fall, when students came back the next year, they had campus police for the first time, their first police chief, and they kind of gave these very publicly facing demonstrations about the fact that the campus is now safe and things like this won't happen again. They struggled early on to narrate how to talk about this incident. I think the thing that really demonstrates how the university understood this, a guy named William Highsmith was the chancellor of UNC Asheville at the time. And after the murder, everyone was distraught. And we talked to a bunch of students who were students at the time. It's chaos. Every male on campus is interviewed by the police. And one of the things that the chancellor says is, let's send the students home for the week. Close everything down. No productive learning is going to take place. When we come back next week, the police will have who's responsible for this. So I think everyone, including the investigators and certainly the university, imagine that crimes like this don't happen in a place like we live in, and that because this terrible thing did happen, it shouldn't be a very involved process to discover who's responsible. And I think everyone was quite shocked, as the years go by, that this became a kind of the kind of specter of Virginia Olsen kind of hung over the university, and that this case was remained unsolved. And the university, I think, struggled then, and they struggle now as well, but they struggle to really kind of narrate, how do you narrate not only the kind of death of a student, but also a violent rape and murder of a student. We were originally scheduled to give a reading. We were supposed to open at UNC Asheville when the book came out in January 2025, but the October before that, so almost 3 months before, Hurricane Helen happened, and Asheville was ravaged, was probably the place hit hardest by that. And then the university got really cold feet because they gave us the legal rights to all the images and gave us full access to everything at the university that we could reprint and use. So that they were very helpful. But early on, we were researching. But when the book was done, it became this calculation, I think, and I don't blame them. I've spent my entire life in university. I understand how this kind of works, and that I've seen this response in many different places, so it's not unique to them. But they made a calculation that it wasn't in their best interest. They didn't want their students immediately coming back after Hurricane Helen. when they'd been online. And the first thing that they were going to talk about, or the first public presentation, is about a student who was raped and murdered. That wasn't the vibe they were looking for. And so we initially tried to kind of delay it and just say, okay, I get that. Maybe 2 months later we'll do it, or later in the semester or something. And then it became apparent that they just didn't want to talk about it. And to this day, I mean, I've emailed. I was hoping to do something on the anniversary in April. I emailed as recently as within the last 2 to 3 weeks, and it's just there's not really any kind of interest on their part in revisiting it. And so my understanding was last year faculty were kind of asked not to, that they were kind of discouraged from participating and helping organize anything for us that was on campus. And so I think at least some of that is just kind of the first time they publicly really acknowledged it. It's not really a memorial. It's called Ginger's Bench. It's like a kind of like a marker they have on campus for. That was only built in the last 12 years. And so, it's one of these things that they don't really know how to talk about, and they still struggle with it. Early on, they attempted to distance the location and try to claim it wasn't on campus. Part of the reason the book is, we call the book The Murder on Campus, is because this was a part of university property. If you look at her death certificate, which we include in the book, it actually says location of death, UNC Asheville campus. So that's where kind of the title comes from. And so it's part of their history. And I think they've struggled to kind of figure out how it fits into that history.
In the book, you do mention that the parents didn't participate in any way in the book. Did you, their sisters or brothers or anyone else, family members that you reached out to for the book? Cameron?
So all of the people we spoke with are, well, the family members. The father died. The father is dead. The mother, at least at the time of writing the book, was still alive, but she was in a assisted living facility. And my understanding was she doesn't have any awareness of kind of what's going on, just in general. And she does have a brother and a sister who are both still alive. We did reach out to them. The family has never given a public statement, even surrounding the death, since 1973, when this happened. I mean, they didn't give one in 1973. They've never publicly spoken about it. One of the detectives who was tied to the case did tell us that actually a big source of a thing that he struggled with was when he wanted to arrest John Rivas, and it became apparent that the district attorney was not going to do it. One of his strategies was to attempt a kind of public pressure campaign. He wanted the parents to basically come forward and give a statement and do things, and he felt like he could potentially put enough pressure on the district attorney where he would at least have to give it a harder public look. And the parents said that it was incredibly difficult for them, and they just couldn't go back and revisit it. And so they refused to help him participate. And so it's they've never spoken, and even the current investigators now have never had any contact with any person in their family. And so it's one of those things that they are a very private family, and so that was something that we struggled with early on, was just, do we have a right to kind of speak for this person? Because she does have some family members alive who don't do this. But I think what I think we ultimately kind of settled into after a period was just that we had an obligation to speak for her because no one else was. And that includes her family. That's not a knock on them, but she deserves to have someone advocate for her.
Cameron, we're wrapping up here. So I do want you to you're doing podcasts now. You have a crime podcast. It's like, what an incredibly different idea. No, I'm teasing.
Yeah. Funny how that works, right?
Tell my audience about, I like cross podcasting. I think it's important. If we don't talk about it, who will? So tell us about your podcast.
So when we were promoting this book, we started to do a number of podcasts, and eventually got the attention of a friend of mine who has a podcast called Failure to Stop. And we went on to his podcast, and it's one of those fun shows where they do police breakdowns for the most part. But afterwards, he asked me, I was like, did you enjoy doing this? I was like, absolutely. I'd love to have my own show. And he just was casually like, okay, well, why don't you start? And so Santana True Crime was born. We now have been going for about 6 months now, and I've got a pre-recorded show that airs every Tuesday. And then I've got a live show that airs on YouTube every Thursday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
And so you got this is together though. The both of you are doing it, or just you, Cameron?
Well, so Brian comes on a lot, and Brian is my unofficial researcher. So
How long did it take about from when you sort of said, let's do this till publication, give or take?
it's like 2 years.
2 years. That's not bad.
Yeah, well, and part of the rush actually with that too was, or maybe not rush, but part of the timeline was we did have more information that came in after the book was published. A lot of Virginia Olsen's friends are in their late 70s now, and so we were really trying to kind of get this out there while her peers, not only for them and kind of have some of their story represented, but I think also if there were any kind of leads or information that could come about, we're really running out of time right now to get those. And so we did have a lot of different leads came through after the book came out. So it did serve that purpose.
So, Cameron, how about you? Got something to wrap up with?
Yeah, so we're fairly confident that James Gore and John Revis Jr. are the ones that are responsible for this. But one of the goals of the book was to bring awareness to Virginia and her name and make sure that she's not forgotten. And so this is a way to honor her and her memory. A friend of ours always ripped this quote off where he says, you know, people die twice, once during their physical death and then once when they're forgotten. So our goal is that she's not forgotten and we continue to say her name. So we'd appreciate it if people would go out and buy our book. It's A Murder on Campus, A Professor, the Cop, in North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. That's available on Amazon, Kindle, Audible, Barnes & Noble, anywhere where you can get a book. Make sure that you check that out. And if people want to check out my podcast, it's Santana True Crime. You can find that on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, anywhere where you can get a podcast. And if you would like to follow us for more, you can follow me on Instagram at Santana True Crime and TikTok as well.
Sorry, Brian, I guess you probably don't have a list of things. Do you have your own website? Are you just tied to him? I mean, what's up?
I do. So my website is briansantanaauthor.com. So if you're interested in, I've started a new book. I am researching the Deborah Elizabeth Espy case, which was occurred the same year as Virginia Olsen in 1973, but that case was solved, and that case was just closed in the past 2 months, and so gave us hope that this one could be as well. But briansantanaauthor.com, you can get updates about media appearances or any new articles that I am publishing that are out there as well that are true crime related, and you can follow me on Instagram at True Crime Professor if you want to get a look at kind of whatever it is that that I'm diving into individually or that I am writing shotgun with Cameron on for other projects.
So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I want to thank our guests this evening. It is an evening one. I don't usually do, even though this was fun. Cameron and Brian Santana, they be bros in more than one way. And the book, again, A Murder on Campus, The Professor and the Cop. And as pointed out, you can get it everywhere. I think, or you can even go to a local bookstore. They'll order it for you. Every bookstore will order it for you, maybe $1 more, and you got to wait a week, but that supports local businesses. But however you get it, read it, enjoy it. And I'm sure, because I don't get a lot of feedback usually, I think after you read it, give the author some feedback. Again, you got email on all the websites and Instagram and the rest of it, so you can thank them because I think it's important. So again, good evening, gentlemen.
All right. Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.